What's up guys, Alexander here. I want to share a new study with you that I just read today about incels. A few new studies have come out recently on this. I made a video about one, you might want to go back and see that. But here's going to be the newest one. And this study looked at specifically measures of social dominance orientation, anti-egalitarianism, willingness to date, self-esteem, sexual optimism, social anxiety, education level, a few other things. So let me tell you a little bit about this study first, about the demographics. This is a sample size of 129 men. This would be considered a large sample in psychology. Medium sample size in the field is about 80 people. Just to say right off the bat, if you think that this sample size is not sufficient, make sure to see my article titled "No, the sample size is good enough," or something similar to that effect. With a sample size of 129 men, if you had about 10 million incels, for example, in the United States, that would let you generalize to them with a margin of error of about 2 to 3%. So, 83% of this sample were white young men, 7% Asian, 5% Latino, so a predominantly white sample. Mean age 25 with a standard deviation of 7, so a little bit of a range there, but we're looking mostly at young men between 18 and 30 given that mean and standard deviation. So getting right into the results of this study, they found that social dominance orientation and anti-egalitarianism predicted Inceldom. Incels were more likely to score higher in these two measures. Social dominance orientation is basically an endorsement of hierarchy, of a tooth and nail struggle in society around you. This is something closely related as well to authoritarianism, specifically measured by the right-wing authoritarianism scale. So these are people that tend to enjoy authority, they tend to enjoy hierarchy, they tend to endorse a society based on strict rules where the strong dominate the weak. And the Anti-Egalitarianism Scale is basically exactly what it sounds like. It's a measure of opposition to social egalitarianism. These two measures, they correlate to about 90%. So, and that's what we see actually in the results here as well, that the scores on both of these correlate to about 90%. So what that shows is called construct validity, essentially that we are consistently measuring the same thing, the same tendency across constructs. A second scale that predicted Inceldom, this scale, again, administered to incels and to non-incels in the sample, is called the willingness to date scale. And as opposed to being a true willingness to date, this scale is actually intended to measure shyness. And what we see is that incels are much, much more shy than the non-incels in this sample. Much less likely to approach, much less likely to ask women out. Related to that was a scale called sexual optimism, and that is basically how desirable you view relationships. If you're someone who considers yourself, for example, red-pilled or black-pilled, there's a good chance that you score low in sexual optimism, and that's what we see in this study, is that incels score lower in sexual optimism. They view relationships as more negative in general, women as less trustworthy, that sort of thing, than the non-incels do. And of course, if you are shy and you score low in sexual optimism, this is going to affect if you ask women out, if you go out there and speak to women and try to approach women. And that is another thing that was measured in the study. And of course, incels, again, score lower in this. They're less likely to approach women. They're less likely to ask women out. So a lot of the time, incels frame their inceldom as being related to solely physical characteristics. What we're seeing here, and we'll continue as well with the other measures, is that there are actual personality differences as well between incels and non-incel populations. If those personality differences negatively affect your dating outcomes is debatable. They probably do if you're scoring low in sexual optimism and willingness to date, because these are basically measures that predict if you're going to approach women at all. And I think most incels know that they do not approach women regularly. Some do. Occasionally you'll see some in the comments that come out and say, oh yeah, I've approached 1 million women and they all reject me because I'm ugly. Okay, so some do, but many incels have not spoken to a woman in years. They gave up very, very early on, and these are young men, you know, they gave up before they should have given up. If these were 45, 50-year-old men, they say, I'm old now, I'm out of shape, women aren't attracted to me. It might be much, much more understandable, but these are men who are like, I got rejected by a woman when I was 18 and I haven't spoken to a woman since because it traumatized me for life. Okay guys, you can't give up that early. So, moving on. Incels score much higher in this study in a measure of social anxiety, which again is going to contribute to that inability or that unwillingness to approach women. Again, we see a personality difference as well that will affect your relationship outcomes. Do you guys really think that having high social anxiety has no effect on your success with women? I mean, come on guys, you know it does. What more can be said about that? You guys know if you can't approach women, if you're high in social anxiety, it's not just your looks, that's a personality difference. Individual differences in personality that will negatively affect your relationship outcomes. And I want to say, incels that are watching this video, I'm not judging you guys. I'm not criticizing you, I'm just describing the results here, some empirical differences that we observe between incel populations and non-incel populations. So, what we see that's lower in incels in this study, again, were two measures. Self-esteem is lower, and assertiveness is lower. So again, these are two things that are going to directly impact someone's ability and willingness to approach women. It will affect their confidence if they do speak to women. If you have low self-esteem and low assertiveness, that probably explains some of the variance in why incels simply do not approach women that frequently at all. And these are also probably things that will, all else being equal, make you less attractive to women if you are a man who has low self-esteem and low assertiveness. Because women are attracted to those sorts of things. And it doesn't mean that you must be this stereotypical dominant alpha masculine Chad. But if you have low self-esteem and low assertiveness and you're a weak little dude, that's not the most attractive thing, guys. It's not the most attractive thing to women. So what we see here is basically a convergence of all of these personality traits and dispositions, these constructs being measured, and pretty much all of them are less attractive to women. Social dominance orientation, not in this study, but in past research, and this is something I actually studied a great deal in graduate school, was social dominance orientation. This predicts poor outcomes in relationships, guys. So, and maybe I can do a video on that topic specifically in the future if you are all interested, but basically what we see here is a laundry list of personality traits and constructs that are unattractive to women. High social dominance orientation, high anti-egalitarianism, high shyness, low self-esteem, low assertiveness, high social anxiety, low willingness to approach women. It just, down the list, personality differences between incels and non-incels that really put them at a disadvantage. Some of the descriptive statistics here are also telling, and this is something that we found in a past study on incels that I covered in a short video recently, and that's that incels tend to have lower education on average. What we see in this study is that incels, to mention first from a past study, we saw that incels were less employed on average. In this study we actually see that incels and non-incels in this sample have an equal rate of full-time employment. But in general, in past research, we see that incels tend to be employed full-time at lower rates. They have lower incomes at lower rates. And this also applies to single men in nationally representative demographics. They also tend to be unemployed, lower income, and lower education. And in this study, that is what we see as far as education is concerned. Again, we see a replication of the effect that incels on average tend to have a lower level of education. Incels are less likely to be in school full-time by about 15 to 20%, if I'm going from memory here, so it should be somewhere around that number. Incels are less likely to have all degrees from a high school up, so less likely to have graduated high school by a little bit more less likely to have graduated with a bachelor's degree, less likely to have a master's, less likely to have a doctorate, and as I said in the beginning, incels are less likely to be in school full-time. Something that we see in research on attractiveness is called assortative mating, and we also see the converse of that, or I should say not the converse, but an alternative of that, which is called hypergamy. Assortative mating is the tendency for men and women to pick mates who are similar to them. So for example, we usually see that people pick mates from a similar social class, from a similar economic background, from a similar educational background. And educational assortative mating is very, very strong. Women generally do not prefer to pick men who have lower education, and often prefer to pick men who have higher incomes and higher education than they do, and that's called hypergamy. The tendency to date across or up the social hierarchy or the hierarchy of income or education. So here we see another factor, aside from this laundry list of personality traits that puts incels at a big disadvantage. We also see incels are putting themselves at a big, big disadvantage when it comes to education. And some people are going to say, oh, it doesn't matter. No, it matters, guys. It matters a lot. I posted a study on this channel, again, recently, that showed, for example, if you post an advanced degree on Tinder, you are more likely to get about 3 times as many matches. Even on Tinder, guys, where looks dominate everything else, just having your degree that says you have a bachelor's degree on Tinder boosts your matches. And if it's a master's degree, it boosts it even more. So your education level matters. And it's not only because education predicts income, although today education still, despite the narrative that, oh, they're useless degrees that put you in debt, education still predicts income, even for young people, by a pretty large amount. But even despite the association with income, education is one of the best signals of intelligence and social status in Western society. It's highly correlated with IQ, guys. And intelligence is a trait that has been selected for evolutionarily since the beginning of humans. That's why we are what we are. Women in general prefer more intelligent men, an effect that has been observed and replicated over and over and over. And some of you are going to say, oh, but I know a Chad who's dumb and women like him because he's beautiful. Okay, we're not comparing intelligence with facial attractiveness and saying it's more important. This is just one of many variables that is very important for attractiveness in a relationship. And it's also important for relationship outcomes. I have posted research on this channel already, and it's something that has been replicated consistently, but if you have a bachelor's degree, your divorce rate is about 30% compared to a national average of 50%. If you have an advanced degree, a master's degree or above, it drops down to 15%. Your education level, as well as IQ, and these are very correlated things, as I mentioned, these predict your relationship outcomes. And people who are smarter, people who are more intelligent, people who have higher levels of education have better relationships, guys. They have better relationship outcomes. Why? What's the relationship, the causal factor there? That's a whole other question, but these things predict good relationship outcomes, basically. And incels, if they're not going to school, they're not going to be a part of that population that has good relationship outcomes on average, assuming they even get into a relationship. So, summing up from this study, what do we see, guys? We see a list of personality traits and constructs, some of them ideological, like social dominance orientation and anti-egalitarianism, that predict men doing poorly with women, that predict men being incels. We see low education, again, like we see consistently across the research, predicting poor relationship outcomes, predicting inceldom, and so on. Well, not much more to say about that, guys, so I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something. If you like these kind of studies, if you want to read more research on the psychology of dating and attraction, like the channel, subscribe, hit the bell so you can get notifications when I upload something new, and I will talk to you guys later.